Hello, I'm Katty Kay, based in Washington.
And I'm Carlos Watson in California.
Welcome to When Katty Met Carlos,
a new show exploring what's shaping America today, brought to you by the BBC World Service and OZY Media. Katty, welcome back.
Thank you, Carlos. It has been, as you know, because I lost my mother in November and I lost my father a week ago, it's been a rough couple of months, but it is good to be back on the program, and this is a conversation I am excited to have.
Well, we missed you, and we're thinking about you, and of course thinking about your folks, and so thank you for being back with us. And what a time to be having this conversation about immigration and where the U.S. stands with that. In today's show, we explore immigration and ask whether America really is a melting pot. It's a country founded on immigration. It's core to America's sense of identity. But what does it mean today after 4 years of policies designed to dissuade immigrants from coming to the U.S.? We saw the ban on people from a number of Muslim-majority countries entering America, and there's the so-called Trump wall on the border with Mexico.
Yeah, it was interesting that one of the first things that Joe Biden did when he came in as president was to sign that executive order removing that travel ban you're speaking about, Carlos, and he suspended the construction of the southern wall for 2 months as border security officials work out what they're going to do next. Those at the sharp end of this story are immigrants themselves, and it's often been fertile territory for comedians like Cristela Alonso.
I'm Mexican. I get tired of people trying to stereotype us because they never get it right. You get a group that says, Mexicans are lazy. Then they say, Mexicans are taking away our jobs. Which one is it? Are we lazy or are we taking away our jobs? This Mexican took my job and now he's taking a nap.
I love that.
All right, that's certainly good comedy, but we know that stereotypes have been a critical part of the immigration story. To get some data about what's happening here, we spoke to Mark Hugo Lopez, a demographer from the Pew Research Center.
The U.S. has about 45 million immigrants. Together, they make up almost 14% of the nation's population, and that's actually approaching a record high for the share foreign-born among Americans. The last time we've seen something like this was back in the 1890s. The country today is much more diverse than it was back in the 1960s, with Asian Americans and particularly Latino Americans driving much of that demographic change. And to give you some sense of this, since 2010, the nation's Hispanic population has accounted for half of the U.S. population growth. About another quarter has come from Asian Americans, and a good part of the remainder has come from Black Americans. The white population in the United States has basically stayed the same over these same 10 years. But I do think it's interesting that the U.S. is still one of the world's top, if not the top, destination for international migrants. Today, for the United States, the largest group of new arrivals are from Asia, from India, and from China, and no longer from Latin America, which for 40 years had been the main source of new immigration. Another big trend is the intermarriage rate. Among Asian American newlyweds and among Latino newlyweds, you'll find that more than a quarter marry somebody who's not of the same race or ethnicity. Also, among whites and blacks, you see intermarriage rates rising as well, so that today about 15% of all marriages in the United States are intermarriages. And that is leading to a growing number of people who say that they are mixed race. And so when we talk about the nation in the 2040s, for example, many demographers say that the nation will be a majority non-white country. But that may be too sharp of a definition, because with intermarriage and mixing, how people in the future in the United States see their identity remains to be seen. But by 2045 or 2046, the U.S. Census Bureau projects that the nation will not have any one single racial or ethnic group in the majority.
So there are plenty of changes going on impacting American identity. Our first guest was born in Vancouver, Canada, to Korean immigrant parents. And at the age of 21, she moved to New York City.
You gotta go to one killer B, never kill now. Drop that down, pass all around. Lyrics get hard, quick cement to the ground. For any MC in any 52 states, I get psycho, killer, Norman bass.
Sophia Chang has been described as the first Asian woman in hip-hop, managing various artists like D'Angelo and ODB from the Wu Tang Clan, who we've just heard. She's now a screenwriter and author and is developing various TV projects. Sophia, good to talk to you again. Welcome to the show.
Nice to have me here. Thank you, Kitty and Carlos.
Sophia, talk to me a little bit about your experience as an immigrant. Did you feel welcome when you first came to New York? Did you feel out of place? Where were you?
I think that I felt very much in place, and that's what I love about New York, is that it's this mosaic, and I think it's what draws a lot of immigrants, particularly immigrants of color, to the city.
Sophia, give us a little bit of your background, how your journey brought you to the US.
So my parents emigrated from Korea. My mother escaped from North Korea to South Korea, met my father in South Korea. They emigrated to Canada in the 60s, and then I myself immigrated to America. So I'm a Korean-Canadian emigre to the US.
So a pretty circuitous route to get here.
Indeed.
And Sophia, so were you more at home in Canada or in the US? In other words, your parents were immigrants there, and did you ever feel in any way welcomed differently there than you did in New York City?
Yeah, well, I'm gonna give you a two-part answer to that question. So the first is that the way that I answered the first question, right, is that I felt more welcome in New York because of the nature of how diverse it is, right, ethnically and religiously and in every other way. And also what drew me to New York was that I heard the message by Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. So I was drawn to New York by hip hop. And I think a lot of immigrants of color, I know a lot of my Asian American friends found that hip hop gave them this grounding and a language that could speak to their experience. So I came here in 1987, coming to the Mecca, to the birthplace of hip hop itself, also made it a more welcoming, another layer of welcoming for the city in particular.
So Sophia has hip-hop. Let's introduce our second guest, who has cooking as a way into the country. Marcus Samuelsson is an award-winning chef and author and has restaurants right across the States, including the Red Rooster in Harlem, which I am hoping to get to when this pandemic is over. He also created President Obama's first state dinner. Marcus, lovely to have you on the program.
Thank you so much for having me. Very happy to be here.
First of all, your name is Marcus Samuelsson, and Samuelsson is the least Ethiopian name I have ever heard in my life. So tell us a little bit about your name and your route to America.
Yeah, that's what we're learning, right? Blackness, immigration, it's layered, it's complex. You know, I was adopted from Ethiopia to Sweden. So my birth name was Kasahun Sigai, and then I was adopted to a Swedish family. But I knew that eventually, or my parents knew that eventually one day I would move to America specifically. And there were various signs to that in my upbringing. Like, you know, we had English speaking week in Sweden, like my dad and my mom drilled in that English would be a very important language to us. And, you know, one day I had to move to the States. It was a lot of different things that pointed to that.
And now that you've come here, you have various TV cooking shows.
Houston, where West Africa meets America.
Nigerians love spicy food.
Yeah. Tell me about the suya Hennessy chicken, because those are like some of the best things in life. This dish, I really feel African.
That's what we're shooting for.
Now it's cool.
That's from No Passport Required on PBS, where you visit Marcus' various cities and explore the impact that immigrants have had on American cuisine.
Sure, but I mean, you know, Sophia talks about hip hop. You know, the very first time I came to the States, for me, it was hip hop too. You know, it was Rakim. The one thing America keeps doing is produce cool stuff. It's not so much do we produce Ford or not. We produce hip hop. We produce content that the rest of the world want to come to, right? Ingenuity and immigration is actually one, because you create out of necessity.
Marcus, talk a little bit, if you would, about whether that welcoming environment that you and Sophia both are talking about you think is limited to New York or big cities in general, or whether you think that is a broader asset and part of the American experience.
Well, I'll tell you about my experience, right? I have the blessings of being black, but also the blessings of coming from Northern Europe. Right? So as a Swede, I noticed my Swedish, immigrants friends, they never saw themselves as minorities nor immigrants when they were in New York City. I was like, wait a minute. We are definitely minorities and immigrants. They were like, no, they're majority white. They spoke English. They were part of the American fabric like that. And as a black person, I constantly felt that I was both an immigrant and a minority. That didn't mean that I didn't feel I could add value, but it was a completely different experience than my 4 other roommates that happened to be Swedish and white, because the way they entered the city was like, we belong, we're from Sweden, we have the right to be here. And I felt very, very, very different. And it's also experienced itself that, anytime you met a police officer and all of those, classic, we had 2 completely different immigrant stories. For me, it turned out well anyway, but it's just, those are 2 vastly different experiences.
Can I ask both of you, you've both had very different routes to America, you've both come from very different parts of the world and brought with you to the States the roots of your own cultures. Do you feel American? Sophia, do you feel American? Let's start with you.
I don't feel American. I feel like a New Yorker. I don't feel American at all.
What an interesting phrase, Sophia, saying that I don't feel American, but I feel like a New Yorker. Say more about what that means to you.
I've lived in New York now for 34 years, and I completely buy into the notion of American exceptionalism. To the question that you asked, Marcus, do I think that I would have been welcomed like this in the Midwest? Absolutely not. I don't think I would have been embraced the same. All you have to do is look at the demographic, right? So if you plopped Marcus or I in any place that was predominantly white, to a degree more so than New York, I think we would have had a complete different level of comfort. And when Marcus says that he felt like an immigrant and his white Swedish friends didn't, it's not only that, they were not looked at as immigrants. Marcus was, right? So let's be clear. When we talk about immigration in this country, when the racists talk about immigration, they are not talking about Swedes, Danes, the Irish, the Brits, the French. They are talking about immigrants of color, right? Yellow people like me to a far lesser degree than brown people, right? From the continent of Africa, certainly from Muslim countries, right? Nobody was saying, oh, we really have to take a stand on the Dutch who are invading our country. Nobody said that. So for me, why I love New York is, again, we are not a melting pot. I think we are a mosaic. I think that we exist as discrete communities. And so there is a Chinatown, a Koreatown, a Japantown, there are Ethiopian enclaves. There are all of these different enclaves. You can find all of them in Queens, in fact, I think is the most diverse city in the world. And I think that that's what makes somebody like me feel so welcome.
I love the way you describe it, Sophia. I've always thought of America as a bento box and not a melting pot. That there's all these different communities that make up the country, and when it works, it goes together well as a good meal, but they're not all merged into each other. My experience of the Washington area is just the same. Marcus, can I ask you that same question? Do you feel American?
One of the blessings about being American is that you can hold on to the other, and you can always sort of talk about the Ethiopian experience, the Swedish experience, or the New York experience, or the American experience all at once. And that's a license that America gives you. There's not a lot of countries. When you come to become an immigrant in Sweden, you're basically saying goodbye to the roots wherever you came from, and you are trying to become Swedish, which is to say Protestant Swedish, right? Why I prefer America is because end of the day, and specifically New York and the larger cities, is that, we're non-monolithic societies, right? We're very diverse, from TV to lawyers to doctors to bus drivers to chefs to musicians. It's layered, and the one reason essentially why I came to America was I worked in a 3-star Michelin restaurant in France, in Lyon, and chef asked me, what are you going to do? I said, I want to own a restaurant like yours. And he said, it's not possible. And I said, what do you mean? You have to lower your ambition. You have to lower your dream. I said, I can't. I'm here. I want to own a restaurant like you. And then he asked me a rhetorical question. Is there any black chef in France or Europe that have done that? And I said, I don't think so. I don't know. And I was 23 at the time. He said, that's your answer. That was the day when I knew I had to move to New York. And I did. And a couple of months later, I had a 3-star restaurant in New York City. And that can only happen in America, right? There is no other country that can happen.
Jump on stage and then I did.
Sophia, can I pick up on something that Marcus said about keeping his identity in the States? Do you feel you've been able to keep your Korean identity? I mean, and maybe you think it's New York versus the rest of America, but did you feel coming to America more or less than going to Canada that you could keep your Korean identity?
Absolutely. And this is not to cast aspersions on Canada, because I think that they had the mosaic model before America did. It was also about my personal evolution, right, Katty? And so, again, coming to New York, which is so incredibly diverse, and seeing myself in so many different ways was really important to me. So, and again, through the chamber of hip hop, right, I was able to find even more pride in my heritage. I mean, as you cited at the beginning, I managed 3 members of Wu Tang Clan, and their whole ethos is grounded in martial arts movies and in Asian culture. So they helped me see the beauty of my own culture, which as a yellow girl in a white world who wanted to be white, had denied and rebelled against. And again, that I have to say New York, because New York is where I found hip hop and where hip hop embraced me.
Sophie, I want to stay with you just for a second and talk about a little bit of the different experiences among immigrants from different parts of the world. You know, you talk about the fact that you may have, and maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, but you may have had a better, different, welcoming experience as a young Asian woman coming. Do you think that's still true, or do you think that for young Black immigrants or others that there's a greater receptivity today than maybe you saw 34 years ago?
Look, I mean, as long as white supremacy is around, it's always going to be that Asians are far more adjacent to whiteness than are Black and brown and indigenous folks, right? And also because during the 60s, during the civil rights movement, because of the creation of the model minority myth, right, which was designed to create this rift between the Black and the Asian American communities, you know, white people pointing to Asian Americans and saying, they're the model minority. They work hard. Why can't you, AKA Black people, be more like them, right? So we have all internalized this as Asian Americans. What does it mean to be the model minority? We are submissive. We are politically malleable. We are pliable. We do not jump up and down on the table. We do not raise our heads. We keep our heads down, and we work really hard, and we're very industrious. So absolutely, I would say the virulent anti-Blackness that exists in this country, there is no equivalent with any other marginalized, with any other people of color. Now, I'm not saying that Asians don't face racism, no question. I mean, I can attest to that, especially, you know, with everything around COVID. But if any Asians out there hold the position that somehow we have the same experience, similar we can say, equal we cannot, to being Black or brown and indigenous in this country, patently they're just wrong. And again, I'm not saying we don't deal with nonsense. I'm not saying that we don't deal with racism or violence. But I promise you that if you look at the numbers of people, of Black folks who are murdered by the police, men and women, and you look at the numbers of Asians who are murdered by the police, the numbers don't even compare. It will be exponentially higher in the former category, whether you're African American or whether you are like Marcus, right, an immigrant from the continent, from Ethiopia. The experience is going to be the same, because Marcus, to his point, is not read as Ethiopian American. He is read as Black, I believe. Mm-hmm. Marcus, am I right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
And Marcus, it's interesting to hear Sophia talk about Asian Americans, because obviously Korea, Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines, completely different countries with completely different cultural experiences. And you came from Sweden, you grew up in Sweden, so maybe this is not your experience, but you come from Ethiopia, way on the east of Africa. You do not come from Senegal or Cameroon. And yet we talk about immigrants from Africa as if it's one country?
Well, I mean, there's the one drop of midnight, right? Like, there's the law of blackness that is so steeped into American culture. So when somebody is going to be dismissive, trust me, they've not figured out where Cameroon, Ethiopia, or Senegal is. They've just made a decision that, comes from lack of education and lack of experiences. But, end of the day, we're probably at the last bridge of most of this nonsense, because the larger issue at hand are so much bigger than this. And it's going to be ugly for the next 15, 20 years about culture and identity. But we have environmental questions that are even larger than this, right? We have other sort of like choices in terms of urbanism and rural that are so much bigger. Those are going to become the next race debate. Because actually, end of the day, we don't have time for this. We have much, 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 much bigger issues that we have to deal with.
Marcus, we asked Mark Hugo Lopez from Pew, who we heard earlier, about American attitudes towards immigrants. I'd love for you to hear what he had to say.
Since the 1990s, we've seen a reversal of the opinions of Americans about the impact of immigrants on the United States. Back in the 1990s, about 2/3 of Americans said immigrants were a burden to the country because they take jobs, housing, and health care. But since then, and particularly in the last 20 years, a majority of Americans, and in fact our most recent poll shows 2/3 in 2019, said that immigrants were a strength to the country, that they were bringing talent and they work hard, and those were all things that were making the country a better place because of immigrants.
Sophia, is that, when you listen to those numbers and you hear that Americans are more positive towards immigrants than they were 20 years ago, does that ring true to you?
Perhaps. Sure, I believe that it's more open. We elected a black president. But if you're telling me that 67% of Americans feel that immigrants contributed, then how does that square with the percentage of the country that voted in larger numbers than ever before, the 74 million people or whatever it is that voted for Trump? There's a Venn diagram there that I simply do not understand.
Sophia, did you find over the last 4 years, and I may already know the answer to this, but I'd love to hear it from you, and Marcus, from you as well. Did you feel that you personally faced racism in a distinctive way over the last 4 years?
Me? No. No, honestly, no.
Well, I would say, Carlos, I would go back to the blessings of being black and an immigrant that gives you strength, right? When someone can sit at the most powerful office in the world and talk about a-hole countries that come from Africa, etc. All of that is insulting to me. But the beauty of America, we can do two things at the same time. I'm happy that we have documented all the nonsense, and I feel very positive in the future because it's documented and no one can say it didn't happen.
Marcus, I'm always happy to end the program on a note of positivity, so thank you for that. Marcus Samuelsson, Sophia Chang, thank you for a really interesting discussion on your perspectives on immigration from your own lives, but also on where America stands in this big immigrant story.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you both for joining.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Carlos, this whole discussion of immigration, obviously because I am an immigrant living in the United States, is particularly pertinent to me at the moment because I'm going through the process of applying for Swiss citizenship. My father was Swiss and my grandmother was Swiss. And this whole notion of belonging and assimilation is very different. And it was interesting to hear, Sophia's take on having to assimilate in some countries and Marcus's experience of being told in France that he could never make it in France and feeling that he could make it in America. And that notion of where you feel you belong to. And I've lived in America for 25 years, but I actually don't feel particularly American. And I wonder if that comes from the fact that my childhood was not spent in America and that you kind of feel you belong to the country where you grew up or where you have a childhood link to.
Yeah, there's so many ways that people approach it and so many things that either make people feel apart or not. Language, family, economic opportunity, success,
of course,
kind of childhood friends. It's so interesting to see. And Katty, you know that I grew up in Miami, which is an incredibly global place that has welcomed immigrants from all sorts of countries. And I think that there is ultimately a warmer reception today, as Marcus seemed to suggest, as the Pew Research seemed to suggest. We clearly have gone through a moment where that has been debated, and I don't think it's gone. But all in all, I see America as still a receptive place to immigration broadly.
Two things that's interesting. Both of Sophia and Marcus have been very successful in the United States, and that presumably is part of their immigrant experience. It may have made their immigrant experience easier, and it may have made it more positive for them. But as Marcus said, his story would not have been possible in France or in another country. And that Pew Research is showing that this still is, even though Sophia points to the hurdles and points to the different experiences depending on race and religion of immigrants coming to the United States. This is still the country that people want to come to.
Yeah. You know, my last thought on this is it's interesting that we were talking to two folks who benefited from New York's warm embrace. And I wonder if next time, if we end up talking to folks in another part of the country, perhaps Arizona, Texas, or other parts, will we have a similar conversation or a very different conversation? This is definitely worthy of more discussion.
We need to take the show to North Dakota or Indiana.
The right time of year.
Yes, not in winter.
Correct.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of When Katty Met Carlos, a co-production from the BBC World Service
and OZY Media. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review, tell a friend, and of course, don't forget to subscribe. Thank you, and we'll be back soon.